This is John Davis, and along with my colleague Mark Russo, this is the Everstream Analytics 5-minute forecast, and we continue to remain in storm mode, watching now Tropical Storm Ida as it moves inland across the far southern portion of the country. Let's look at the quick update on Ida and the stats as of right now. Ida has weakened to a tropical storm, and the remnants of it are over the southern portion of Mississippi. Max winds are 60 miles an hour. That compares to winds at landfall yesterday of 150 miles an hour. And Ida will continue to weaken as the system does move in a northeast easterly direction over the next couple of days across the eastern U.S. If we look at the overall timeline of this in the history of Ida, this is the track of Ida over the last 5 days, forming in the Caribbean, rapidly intensifying across the Gulf of Mexico, and of course, making landfall here yesterday on the Louisiana coast is a very strong Category 4 storm. The worst is over with Ida. In other words, this is now becoming an assessment of damage and what's happened here, especially after sunrise across those areas along the coastal locations here, and the specifics and how widespread the damage issue are across the region. And that will be an assessment that will continue over the next couple of days. Overall, in Louisiana, certainly one of the worst storms that has ever affected that state. And the overall track of this was more so in eastern Louisiana, much more highly populated than the western portion of Louisiana compared to, Hurricane Laura a year ago across that zone. If we look at some of the statistics here with overall Ida, there's a lot of extremely impressive statistics. A couple of them is that overall Ida was the second strongest storm, tied with Laura last year, to ever make landfall in Louisiana. And again, records extend back into the 1800s. Overall, Ida went through rapid intensification here during the 24-hour period over the weekend. And the rapid intensification that it went through, only 9 hurricanes in the Atlantic have achieved this. And this was by far the furthest northward that we've seen this kind of rapid intensification here just prior to making landfall on the coast of Louisiana. One of the impacts that will be an ongoing impact for quite some time is going to be power outages. And the main power outages right now are in Louisiana, where over 1 million customers, again, in the eastern portion of the state, are without power, and many of these customers will be without power for weeks. Mississippi will be the area that sees the biggest increase in power outages today. As of right now, over 100,000 customers are without power, but as the remnants of Ida move across the state, these numbers will increase pretty dramatically here during the day. The main threat from this point on is flooding. And overall, from a flooding standpoint here coming up, as the remnants of Ida curve across the eastern U.S., certainly some potential of flooding issues across areas not only of the southern U.S., but even areas further north in places like West Virginia and Pennsylvania as we go a little bit later on during the week. So that is going to be the kind of the last portion of the impacts, is some flooding across the eastern U.S. here coming up. Turning our attention now to the overall Atlantic basin, other than Ida, we have no specific threats the remainder of this week to land areas across the Atlantic basin. There's a couple of storms that have formed, but they look like they will stay over the ocean and not affect any land areas. So once Ida and the flooding potential is out of the picture later this week, it looks relatively quiet during the remainder of this week here coming up, with no other imminent threats across the Atlantic basin. Now let's go on to some of the global highlights with Mark.
Thanks, John. This past weekend, we did see Hurricane Nora cause impacts to business operations and supply chain networks on the west coast of Mexico in the states of Jalisco and Sinaloa. Nora became a hurricane as it approached the Puerto Vallarta region and then hugged the coast while tracking northward, and is currently in the process of dissipating over Sinaloa state. The main risk going forward will be continued heavy rainfall across the region. So some of the wind and rain and flooding impacts here in recent days across the western coast of mainland Mexico that will overall subside, but still some risk of heavier rainfall, some flooding there in Sinaloa State the next couple of days. Broadening things out and looking ahead around the world, a few areas we did want to call out here in this 5-minute forecast. Number one, in the Southern Hemisphere, the Cape of Good Hope, some shipping disruptions are likely this week. In fact, there's a high risk due to wind of some vessel restrictions in around the Cape of Good Hope. And then also on the west coast of Australia, high risk of wind disruptions and potential for port closures at the port of Fremantle in around the Perth, Australia region. And then up across the Northern Hemisphere, India, China, and South Korea, there are some localized areas of high risk of heavy rainfall and thus some flooding that could impact business operations and supply chain networks. Within India, that high risk is in around the Mumbai area, where over the next few days, very heavy monsoonal rains could cause some issues here with localized flooding. And then over in South Korea also will see in around the Seoul region, high risk of a heavy rainfall and flooding, along with some wind that could cause, again, disruptions, delays in logistics and supply chain networks and operations over the next few days. This is the risk timeline for Seoul, South Korea, and you can see the high risk starting later today and lasting for about 4 to 8 hours before rainfall subsides and winds calm down, but there is a potential for over 150 millimeters and gusts above 60 kilometers per hour. Again, enough to cause disruptions, even potential closures at key airports such as Incheon International Airport, and then also to business operations within the area. For more details on risks and threats to your supply chain networks and operations, please log into your Everstream account. And thank you for watching today's 5-minute forecast. Get in front of what's ahead.